Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode here. I've got a special one for you guys today. A few weeks ago I did a show that I called 10 Albums That Changed My Life. It was inspired by something I saw on Sea of Tranquility from Pete and Prog Corner. They did this great video where they talked about the most important prog albums to them and to their musical growth and journey. And it was a really fun video to put together and got a fairly good response. I was pretty happy with it. So I've been mulling it over and I want to talk about more records that changed my life. You know, I saw Notes Reviews did their version of it as well, which I really thoroughly enjoyed. And they were able to expand their list a bit beyond the 10 that I restricted myself to, and it made me a bit jealous and wanting to expand my list quite a bit more. It was a pretty narrow view into my tastes, so I'm hoping to expand it a slight bit more and give a little bit more depth to my story and to my musical taste and history here. So, and it's probably not going to be any albums that are wildly different than what you would expect based on the tastes, you know, that I have from this channel, but I just wanted to highlight some more amazing records and talk more about my journey through life and what has meant the most to me. You know, it's been a little bit of a tricky couple weeks. A couple of the videos I thought would do well haven't, and some of the reviews are not getting much attention, which is unfortunate, but I thought a good refresh would be just to talk about the albums I love in a very unscripted, just laid-back, fun format. So that's what I'm doing today. It's kind of like my version of Testimony 2, if you're familiar with Neil Morse. He did this Testimony album, which detailed his whole conversion story, his story about why he left Spock's Beard and embraced this Christian direction, basically. And Testimony 2 was basically filling in all the gaps, you know, talking about all the details of the story that weren't discussed in the first go-around of the story in the original Testimony album. So that's what I'm doing here today. This is my Testimony 2. This is my musical journey part 2. So we're going to go back once again to the origin story and go a little bit chronologically through time and my discovery of these albums. So starting off the bat, I talked last time about how when I was younger, I really was into the Beatles. That was what hooked me into music at a young age. That's what my dad started me on. But as I was growing up a little bit, getting into like preteen, teenage years, I was really into rock, and I talked a bit about my love of alternative rock and things of that nature. But what I was also falling in love with was classic rock. A lot of my friends were into it, and they'd like give me little mixtapes and CDs of different songs that they really loved in the classic rock genre. And so a lot of those classic rock albums really stuck with me. I mean, mostly at the time it was more about the big singles and having these mixtapes of various different big songs that you'd probably hear a lot on classic rock radio. But one of the albums that stood out to me is the Boston's album, so I'll call this my first of this group of albums that influenced me. Just a wonderful album. To me, one of the best examples of classic rock that you could find. Just every track is fantastic. I fell in love with this at first listen. It was just a fantastic work. Just really ignited my love for rock, and especially for the 70s style rock, I would say. And I think it introduced me a little bit to some of those prog flourishes that would excite me later, especially with something like Foreplay Long Time, which is this really expanded track that goes in a lot of different directions, has this big instrumental opening that goes in a lot of cool ways. So that was starting my journey little bit by little bit, expanding into this prog realm, I think. And I think that's probably how a lot of people got into it, is hearing little touchstones of it through some classic rock cuts and through these different bands that were on radio and leading you into a deeper direction. I know a lot of people who grew up in the 60s and 70s. It was just a popular style that many embraced at the time, so it wasn't like this weird underground thing that it seems to be now. But not officially picks on the list, but I wanted to mention Queen's A Night at the Opera is another one that was in this vein. I loved Bohemian Rhapsody from a very young age and knew that that was the style of music I loved. And this just has so much fun to it. It has that classic rock vibe, but a lot of campiness, a lot of, you know, cool genre hopping and doing different things. I love Freddie Mercury's style. And also Kansas, you know, their album Leftoverture. I really loved Carry On Wayward Son from a very young time. I thought it was such a cool classic rock track that was always one of the highlights on my list. So Those were early examples. In fact, Kansas is pretty much a fully fledged prog band. I didn't know it at the time as a young teenager that they had so many like full blown prog tracks. I was mainly into, more of the hits and, Carry On Wayward Son in particular. But it really led me down the road. I think it opened my ears up and it primed me for the sound that I would be introduced to from my dad. And I wanted to mention as my second pick on the list is an album that I discovered more in the alternative modern rock direction that I was into at the time. I talked about Incubus and Morning View and how that really introduced me to the album format. I want to talk about Tool's Lateralis. This was a very super influential album that I just completely adored when it came out. It once again, I think it was leading me down the path into progginess. It was not full-blown prog, but it was, leading me in that direction, I suppose, because it blended that alternative rock, hard rock style that I was liking with these more progressive undertones. The funny thing is actually, back when I first was listening to Lateralis, I downloaded the first, the title track from it because it was a pretty notable modern rock track. I'd always look at the Billboard modern rock tracks. That was my big thing. And I'd pretty much download every song that was on that list. And anytime there was new songs coming out, I would download them and check those ones out. So Lateralis, the title track, came out one of those weeks. And funny enough, I thought it was too long for my makes tape or whatever make CD that I was putting together of all the modern rock tracks. So I actually snipped it into basically in half, so it was more palatable at the time. But now as a big prog fan, that's kind of silly to me because now I embrace the big prog epics and the long lengthy songs. So just a silly little side note about my taste at the time. But as you guys know, if you've watched my channel and watched the previous video, my dad introduced me to prog when I was in my teens, and it was a really special time bonding with my dad, and he got me into Gentle Giant, Genesis, and Yes, which I talked about in the other show, so I won't mention those bands and those albums. But what I was doing on the side was trying to explore my own lane of prog stuff that my dad wasn't so into. So I was trying to expand the field a little bit, because my dad is really into those three artists, but he doesn't much know about stuff outside of that little bubble. Those were three artists that really connected with him when he was younger. And he wasn't like me, who's furiously trying to consume every prog album that I can come across. So I really came across this on my own. I wanted to highlight this one next, is Pink Floyd's Animals, which I really like this one a lot. And I remember going on vacation with my family, and we rented out a boat. And I just remember just sailing on this boat and listening to Animals, especially Dogs, the track, which I really absolutely adored at the time, and just loving this music and really connecting with it on a deeper and deeper level. So Pink Floyd's a band I came into on my own, knowing that they were one of the big prog bands that my dad just didn't really get into very much, surprisingly. So I was listening to them on the side while my dad was introducing me to other classic prog. And on the same vein, the next pick is Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick, which I also discovered somewhat on my own too. My dad does enjoy this album. He did have this album as a younger man, but he wasn't really showcasing me this one quite so much because he was so focused on those other three artists. So I was listening to this on the side and being blown away, loving the folkier, more acoustic sound that is on display there. But to me, it just runs the gamut. And I love the concept album feel to it, how it's one just continuous track I was always a big fan of, and a funny, quirky concept. So that album was really connecting with me on the side and becoming one of those bedrock, progressive rock albums that was really building that foundation for me as I continued through this next part of my journey. So, and then I mentioned it before, but I wanted to highlight this album in particular. Is this album was one that, this is probably the most influential album, and I didn't even put it in my list last time, Bridge Across Forever by Transatlantic. This is just totally up my alley in musical taste, just life-changing album. For some reason, this connects with me on such a deep level. And when I heard it, just my whole life was altered, very much so. When I first was getting into new modern prog, the story goes that I downloaded, basically, I found Transatlantic in my searches and on the internet, and decided to download a track from each of the bands that composed Transatlantic. So the very first new prog song that I downloaded was actually Transatlantic's Duel with the Devil, and that's the opening track on this album, and one that I absolutely adore and love now. And it led me down the path towards these other prog bands that I fell in love with and that I mentioned in the prior video. Led me and my dad to go off and buy the first Spocksbeard record and the first Flower Kings record, and started me down that path. But it was this that started it, basically. Mostly just the name Transatlantic, but Duel with the Devil particularly was a track I loved right off the bat. And when I picked up this album complete, like later on, I just was blown away by it all over again. Stranger in Your Soul is maybe my favorite prog song of all time, my favorite song of all time, full stop. I just think it's a perfect prog epic and just the perfect encapsulation of Neil Morse and his talents, and just the band on fire and doing all the things I love in progressive rock. So listening to that track in particular was just mind-blowing, and I just fell deeply in love with it. And that's definitely an album that changed my life. And more in the same vein, I didn't really highlight the Flower Kings in particular. This is Unfold the Future. I did get Back in the World of Adventures first. That was the first Flower Kings album, which I enjoyed, but I was probably higher on the Spocksbeard record that we got at the same time. But this album I got a little bit later. This was the newest album when I was first getting into the band, Unfold the Future. And I've talked about this on the channel before, but I was really getting into this nerdy prog stuff. That was like all I was listening to and obsessed with. And I put it on like my Christmas list, like, hey, I know these are going to be hard to find. Because at the time, I had a hard time finding a lot of these obscure prog records in stores and stuff. So I knew it was a long shot, but I put it on my Christmas list, and my grandparents ended up getting me this album, Unfold the Future, as well as Snow by Spocksbeard, and those became two of my all-time favorite albums. I just couldn't get enough of them, these two sprawling double-disc albums by these artists that I was starting to fall head over heels for, and Unfold the Future in particular, the Truth Will Set You Free opening track was just something that I couldn't get enough of. It was mind-blowing at the time, and I just loved it to death and listened to it over and over. So it was definitely an influential album that really inspired me and took me down further roads. This is another one that inspired me at the time, Aryon's Into the Electric Castle. This is Arjen Lucason's project with a million different guest singers, and it's a sprawling concept album. It's a little bit blurring the lines between progressive rock and progressive metal a little bit, but it's so fantastic, has such a great cast of vocalists and instrumentalists, and it's just a really beautiful record that I fell in love with at the time. It really blossomed my love of the concept album and having these stories as part of the album. I'm also, not surprisingly, a bit of a fantasy sci-fi nerd on the side as well. I love fantasy sci-fi movies and books and all that stuff. So to have this very sci-fi-ish concept and story play out over my favorite kind of music that I was falling in love with was just a marriage made in heaven, and couldn't get enough of this album when I first came across it, and have subsequently gotten all of the Aryon albums, and I love them all dearly. This long continuous storyline that just continues to pay dividends, and I could not be more thrilled to be a fan of that group and of Arjen Lucason. So that really expanded my mind into these sci-fi concept album directions. And anytime I came across a concept album, I was already immediately hooked and interested in what they had on display there. So another big one for my musical taste and my growth, Million Town by Frost. This came out when I was in college, and I was, probably buying way too much music at the time. I was really obsessed with buying CDs, and every album that got even a little bit of buzz in the prog community, I just automatically bought, without hearing a note of it. I had Greg Walker at the time was I believe he's part of symphonic music, and he was like my drug dealer at the time, basically giving me all the prog that I ever wanted. I'd order all the CDs through him, and I lived fairly close at the time to where he's from, so I'd get albums like the same day or next day. It was just really a great fun time to listen to new music and discover things, and this Frost album really blew my mind, because to me it brought together this neo-prog style, but did it in a way fresher and more modern way than I was hearing from other artists at the time. So it just felt like a really strong record that, utilized almost some pop hooks in the vocals, some heavier sounds at times with the instrumentation, but everything was just so pristine and well produced, and it went off in these really cool directions musically with these really great bright sounds and these really cool instrumental passages and great keyboard work and great guitars, and it was just, everything sounded so pristine and so beautiful to me, and the title track was just magical. It just really goes through so many different movements and just captivates me all the way through its runtime. So just an album I was obsessed with and couldn't get enough of at the time. Another album, this is somewhat of the college years albums that I was obsessed with. And for me, I'd get the CD and then I'd put it in my car, and it would just be in my car for like months and months at a time. And this was one that was in my car for months and months. This was Doomsday Afternoon by Fido. One of the greatest modern prog albums in my estimation. I think this is just a fantastic work. It brings a little bit of a new style to the prog genre, in my opinion. It's a little bit more unique and varied compared to just your average, let's just copy and paste what Genesis and Yes have done in the past. And it has a bit of an indie flavor. Fido's just such a unique individual and writes such pristine, cool music that just sounds different from anything else, and I think that was much needed at the time that I was listening to this music. I needed something a bit fresher that scratched a different itch in my brain, brought a little bit of maybe an indie sound to this very classic progressive rock palette, and I just really loved this sprawling work, and I feel like it went into so many different cool directions. It's like art rock mixed with prog, and it just really captivated me and brought me into the fold of a fan of him. And I was able to meet Fido in a club in LA, and that was a great experience. And he even let me listen to one of his albums early, and I reviewed it on my blog at the time, which is a little bit embarrassing, but I got a lot of attention for my review of his album Snow Torch, and he was very kind about it and shared it on his socials, so it brought attention to my blog at the time. So it was just a really cool experience being a music fan and even getting to interact with some of these artists in limited ways. It was just a really fun experience. The other ones, these aren't official picks, but I wanted to showcase the other ones that stayed in my car for long periods of time was this one, It Bites the Tall Ships. When I first heard this, it just wormed its way into my brain and I couldn't stop listening to it. So it was in my car for months and months at a time. This one, the Flower Kings record, Some of No Evil. It's my favorite Flower Kings record, and it just hit at just the perfect time for me. Just everything about this record is special, and I played it nonstop in my car for months and months. I just couldn't get enough of it. The opening track, One More Time, is just such a great opener. There's a great epic in here, Love is the Only Answer, and then you get this fantastic conclusion to the record also. Just a beautiful, beautiful record that I couldn't get enough of, essentially. So there's that one. So getting more into the picks proper here, I wanted to talk about the Decemberists. This is one of my favorite records also, The Hazards of Love. Once again, bringing in that concept record love that I had, and experimenting a bit more with something that wasn't my typical flavor at the time. I talked in my other video about The Deer Hunter, which I discovered very much around the same time, but this was another one I took a little bit of a risk on. Went to the local FYE shop, which sold records, and bought the CD of this, and was just really captivated by it and listened to it over and over. It's like this folk rock style, but done in a concept record. It has a bit of that indie flavor that they're known for, so it's not a fully fledged classic prog album. It has a bit of a modern art rock folky taste to it, but it really worked for me in my ears. And anytime I can branch even slightly out of my comfort zone, it really is something that I embrace and love, is hearing something new and different and something a little bit exciting that refreshes my ears a little bit. And so that was just a super fun record to discover and enjoy, and expanded my taste even a little bit deeper. Another one that I really fell in love with was Haken's The Mountain. Haken's one of my favorite groups of all time, and this is the record that really catapulted them into being one of my top tier favorite artists. And I had listened to Aquarius and Visions and had liked them, but this is where I became obsessed with the band and reignited my love for progressive metal, which I was somewhat waning from, as some of my classic progressive metal bands were veering off into different directions or doing what seemed to me to be a little bit weaker material, like Dream Theater at the time. Symphony X was somewhat, sporadic and taking a little bit of breaks from their records. Pain of Salvation was going into a different direction with their like Road Salt albums. So I was just a little bit underwhelmed by progressive metal at the time. And then this came out and it totally flipped the script, and they were able to infuse just the right amount of progginess into this progressive metal bass line, and it worked fantastically well for me. They have a little bit of Gentle Giant quirkiness, especially on Cockroach King, and that added so much to the palette. Anything that has something Gentle Giant-y in it, I'm immediately hooked. That's one of the quickest ways to my heart, is to put some weird, quirky counterpoint vocal, quirky instrumentation similar to what Gentle Giant do, and I'm totally on board. So that's what they did for me. Brought me in with the Cockroach King, and I couldn't tear my ears away from everything else that's on the record too. So that was an important one to me. Another one, I don't have a prop to hold up for this one, unfortunately, but the next one on my list is Moon Safari's Lover's End. Moon Safari was another revolutionary band that really expanded my mind and my taste. I really adore their sound and style. I've always loved a cappella vocals and the blends that a lot of these a cappella groups have, just the pristine sound of voices coming together to create something beautiful. And Moon Safari took that aspect of something I love, these really tight a cappella harmonies, and brought it into a progressive rock foundation, and it was just a marriage made in heaven for my ears. And of course, Bloom Jude was like the first love. That's what I listened to first and immediately brought me into fascination and love with the band. But to me, Lover's End was just such a special record at the time. It was something I desperately needed. I had been through kind of a weird breakup situation at that time in my life. I had just graduated college and was a little unsure what to do next with my life. And I felt alone and by myself in a lot of ways. And this album was just like a comforting hug, because a lot of it's about, leaving a love behind. It's about, Lover's End, obviously the title. It's about, breaking up and moving on and how tough that can be. But they do it with these melodious sounds and these beautiful, just expansive vocal arrangements. And it just really enveloped me in warmth when I really desperately needed it at the time. So it's just such a special, meaningful album that I'll always love and hold in high regard. I know a lot of Moon Safari fans probably don't count this as like their best work, but for me, because of the personal connection, it's just my favorite work from them. And every time I listen to it, I melt into a puddle. Just, this is like the music that defined me at the time and that I just couldn't get enough of and really got me through the hard times. So that's a special album that changed me and helped me get out of my funk at the time. And I was also exploring other avenues. So another album that I wanted to mention on this list, The Reign of Kendo and their album This Is What Happens. A band probably not heard of much on the prog streets so much. They're not really fully fledged prog, but I think a lot of prog fans like them because of their musicality, and they're just a really intricate, well put together band. Reign of Kendo just does this more jazz rock style, but infuse little bits of progginess into their music as well. They're just so good at what they do. They're just really excellent, upstanding musicians. And when I heard this album, This Is What Happens, my mind was blown. I loved the jazzy sort of sounds. That's just a style of music that's really spoken to me. I really like Steely Dan, the classic albums. I considered putting Steely Dan's Asia or something like that on this list, because that's a style of music I really adore that I don't talk enough about. But this brought that sort of sound to me in a more modern context, and I just love Reign of Kendo and what they continue to do, and I think they're just such an amazing group that's a bit underrated. Hoping they come out with a new album at some point, but it's a really fantastic group that I think deserves more attention, and I would love to talk about more. And then I wanted to mention the Punch Brothers, and this album, The Phosphorescent Blues, is the next one on my list, because this brought me into the world of bluegrass, which is another style that I really enjoy. Once again, don't talk about it a lot on the channel, but I did talk about Nickel Creek this year, which is going to be one of my top favorite albums of the year, just to warn you. Celebrants is the name of that album, which is another life-changing, beautiful record, featuring Chris Thile as the connector in that. He's on this record, and he's also part of Nickel Creek. He's a fantastic mandolin player and singer, just a virtuoso musician, and I love everything he's a part of. I love the Goat Rodeo sessions that he's a part of with Yo-Yo Ma. But that's what brought me into the fold of bluegrass, just hearing the technicality of it. I like the sound and the arrangement. It brought a new, different kind of flavor. I like some of the instrumental moments. And this album in particular, I think the Punch Brothers do it the best for me because they add a progginess to their sound that gives it more variety and more interest. You know, the first track on here, Familiarity, is a long track. It's like nearly 10 minutes long, and it goes through so many different things. There's like these almost Beach Boys-esque harmonies at times, and it's the slow build. There's classical sounds in their arrangements sometimes, and it just fascinated me and brought me into a whole new world of musical appreciation. You know, I really love bluegrass now, and I love this style in particular, and I will always champion Chris Thile and his projects. So that's a great one. And then the last one on my list, probably the most recent record that really changed my life and brought a new facet to me. I mean, I talked last time about No Spoon and their album Opus from this year, so that's probably the most recent one that's really brought change to me in a different way, but it was more about the community and about bringing this new artist that no one had discovered into a bigger light and sharing in that excitement with my fellow prog community now that I have my channel. But before starting my channel, the big album for me was this one, Terraformer by Thank You Scientist. One of my favorite records. I just, the moment I heard this, I was just totally hooked with it. And once again, it expands the taste out a little bit into this more jazzier direction. They have horn players that I think are fantastic. There's these really cool styles that they play around with in both the jazz world, maybe a little bit of a poppiness, especially to some of the vocals. And it's just a really cool blend that brings in a bit of that prog spirit. And I like the youthfulness and vibrancy. It's a younger band, and they really bring a new, fresh face to the prog genre, which I think was desperately needed. And unfortunately, they've lost a couple members since this record, and so it's unclear what's going to happen in the future for Thank You Scientist. They recently announced that their lead singer has left the group, so that's quite a blow, but we'll see if they continue forward from there. So those are the records that I wanted to touch on and talk about. All records that mean a whole lot to me that I heartily recommend to you out there. And if you put these together with the 10 albums I talked about in my previous video, probably a pretty good picture of my musical tastes and a pretty great representation of 25 of my all-time favorite albums that have touched me over the years. So if you were curious about my taste, take a look at that other video if you haven't before, and this one, and you pretty much got the full picture of everything that I'm about in the music world and what I bring to the table. And hopefully you guys appreciate that. Hopefully many of you have similar tastes to me. I know no two people are perfectly identical, so I'm sure there's albums on my list that you don't care for and some that are glaring omissions, but you know, this is my world, my musical taste, and what means a lot to me, and that's what I'm sharing. And so as I continue to struggle a little bit with the channel and what to feature, and, you know, why does this video not do as well as that video? Should I not cover these types of bands over those kinds of bands? I have to just rely on my own taste and my own intuition, and basically just talk about the stuff that touches me and that's important to me. Whether or not people listen is another question, but I have to be authentic and just deliver what's important to me. So that's what I'm doing here, and hopefully you enjoyed the episode. So thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully you'll stick around and enjoy future episodes. I give basically weekly album reviews of new albums that I'm loving and that I heartily recommend if you like the same style albums that I've been talking about in this video. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Let me know in the comments some more albums that changed your life. I know many of you already commented on the prior video, but maybe this gives a chance to talk a little bit more about some extras. And if you didn't comment on the previous video, you can comment here if you would so choose, or go back to that one, whatever you want to do. So thank you guys so much, and as always, just enjoy the music, everybody. That's what it's all about. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in a future episode. Bye, everybody.